Well, hey everybody, welcome to the Branch Podcast. My name is Chris Reed and I'm one of the pastors here at the Tree. And today for the conversation, I'm going to be joined by Pastor Matthew and Pastor Anthony. And this week in our conversation, it's going to be a sobering conversation, but an important conversation. We're going to be talking about the tragic events of this past week, and we wanted to address how we should think about these things as Christians in general, but also as the church as a whole, and why we responded in the way that we did. So please stay tuned for this conversation, and we pray that it's transformative for your life. So let's talk a little bit about the Charlie Kirk assassination. And I know that we've gotten a lot of feedback this week about, for as they viewed it, kind of our lack of handling it as a church on Sunday.
Sure.
But just want to talk about like how we think about crisis such as these things and how we should handle it both personally as Christians, but also in how we handle these things as a church as a whole. Matthew, why don't you go ahead and just kick us off and just talk about why you handled it the way that you did this past week.
Yeah, and honestly, I'll probably talk for a while. You know, this is one of those podcasts where I just want to acknowledge it in case someone's never sat through one of ours. We have chosen as our main method of addressing things that we might find controversial or need more in-depth communication about. We actually will handle it often via podcast. Because it allows us to have an extended amount of time, allows us to be more thorough, to cover a lot more topics, and we think that's actually a safer way to handle that, not in the sense of being afraid to do something, but in our attempt to be the best version of it,
Sure.
to communicate about it. So it was always our intention to discuss those type of topics after the fact. So for us on Sunday, I think it's really important for people to understand, and everything I say today, I'm going to say it bluntly, but I'm really trying to communicate it with kindness and humility. But I think oftentimes people don't understand that for us in church leadership, that we have to have a perspective that is oftentimes different than the individual, because we are pastoring a very diverse church. We're in every way. Not every way, I shouldn't say. I mean, we're in Lancaster, Ohio, so it's not as diverse as I would like in some ways. But I'm saying in schools of thought, in perspectives, in political parties. And so when we're navigating situations, we're coming at it from a different perspective, in that we're thinking about, first and foremost, what has God called us to do? And so every single service, so there's no exception to this, every single service that we have, we've prayed about, we've discussed, and we've planned based on what the Holy Spirit has led us to do. And so that means the worship has to do with the sermon, how we're going to do prayer time, how we're going to do response, like all of that's a part of it. And so when current events happen, it doesn't always change that. It can. I think I wasn't the lead pastor at the time, but after 9/11, there's events where there are times where that Sunday needs to look different, right? And so, but that's not every current event. That's not every tragic situation. We have to be strategic about it. So specifically with this last week, as the assassination of Charlie Kirk took place, I have to be honest, I don't know how many people were impacted by that at the same level. I think those who knew him, who had followed his, basically I'm going to say it this way, his social media, that's their connection to him, I think felt a connection to him. And I understand that because there are people that I follow, and even though I've never met them before in my life, I emotionally connect to them. So there was that group, but there was a huge percentage of people that probably had never heard of him until he was killed. For me personally, I bet but prior to that, I probably saw 6 to 12 videos total of him, and I didn't realize he was a Christian. So in the videos that I saw, they were all, his main source of information was political, conservative, and so I'd watched those, didn't realize he was Christian. So like, I think we were all processing that even in real time of like, who is this individual, what took place, how is this impacting people? And for us, as I processed it, instead of making a decision to address it specifically, because I didn't know really how it would be taken in our church, I just went to God, what do you want me to teach on? And I felt led from what I had already had planned, what we had planned for worship to do, which was a service about pointing people to Jesus. It was about his love and his grace. And even in that discussion, I have other pastor friends outside the church and in text groups. Every pastor friend that I knew that I connected to was going to handle it the same way. I knew in the beginning of service, we would do what we always do. We would offer prayer because we wanted to point people toward the Holy Spirit to receive comfort, because that's the number one gift you can give someone who's hurting, is to point them toward the Spirit of God who promises to give comfort. And so it just happened to be my wife this past week was the MC. And so she was doing the call to prayer. And I had, in a passing conversation, had said, like, are you going to do that? Like, encourage people. She said, absolutely. So she was going to address the tension of the week. And then in the sermon, I'm going to point them to Jesus. And it's never wrong to do that because I wanted people to know, even if there was the response that people anticipated, that because of his assassination, that more people were going to go to church, then I'm like, great. More people at church, point more people to Jesus. That's never going to be the wrong move. And so we had an incredible response at both campuses. Total, we had 34 people that gave their hearts to Christ and then let us know about, which means they're beginning the discipleship process. There were probably many more than that raised their hands and responded. And that's what we're here for. Yeah, I'm unapologetic about that. We're here to point people to Jesus. The irony of those who might be upset, and I want to be clear, the communication, I think all of us got communication from different people about it, so I can't speak for yours. And honestly, this is honest that we haven't had a conversation about it, so I'm not like faking like I'm in ignorance. The communication that I read wasn't angry, it was just curious, and they asked questions. But if people were upset, I would say, honestly, I think if Charlie was still alive and someone could ask him, he would say, don't talk about me. Talk about Jesus. He wouldn't want people to be upset or divided about that, because if he is truly a follower of Christ, which from all accounts he absolutely is, then he would understand the value of pointing people to Jesus, especially even right now, if he's in heaven. So he would fully know what's at stake. And so that was like, for us, we just did what we felt that the Spirit of God led us to do, and it was the right move. 100% the right move.
Yeah, I think one of the other things, so some of the communication that I got, it was really, I would agree with you. It wasn't so much the spirit of like anger in the sense of, the church really let me down, we're going to another church. It wasn't that type of tone. But I think there was a curiosity rooted in, I'm confused, I don't know exactly how to process this. How should we go about dealing with this kind of thing? And I think there's nothing wrong with that mindset. I think we all do that in our personal lives, the things that we go through, the things that we see. And I do want to echo your point. I think it really is important that we have to realize with everything that's constantly happening, and there's a lot that's constantly happening, like we can't just exist as an entity that's basically giving commentary on everything happening in the public, because it does affect people differently. But at the same time, I think we a lot of times want to have answers to our strong feelings of grief and emotion, and we think that the church exists maybe sometimes as to kind of give the silver bullet to solve all the problems. So I think sometimes it's easy for people to view the church, and I'm not saying the church doesn't have answers and we don't proclaim truth, but I think it's captured in the essence of what you said. It's pointing people to Jesus over and over and over again. It's not a one-time, we're going to address this in a service, and now it's all going to make sense to you, and you're going to be able to sleep well tonight. Like, the reality of the world that we live in is that life is messy, and there's things that are painful, there's things that are confusing, and we can't always logically or rationally wrap our heads around things in such a way that it naturally just appeases the problem that we're dealing with. And so I think that's also a tension people have to recognize, that our desire as a church, number one, is to lift up the name of Jesus, to glorify him, to honor him, to worship him, to give him thanks, and to point people to him. And in the process of pointing people to him, to give them a what we would call a biblical worldview, so that when these types of things happen over the course of our lives, we're learning what it looks like when we're dealing with grief, when we're dealing with shocking moments of tragedy. How do we deal with these things? How do we process these things? Because we're in this constant practice of doing that in a daily, weekly rhythm of going to Jesus, of bringing our burdens, of bringing our sins, of dealing with the hard aspects of our lives. So I think it's important for people to understand, while I do think it's good to come to church to look for answers, because I believe God has given us answers and points us to true life in him, I think we have to be very leery of that mindset that we so often see permeate our culture, which is that there's going to be a quick, simple answer and a quick, simple fix to everything. And sometimes we have to just be able to sit in the discomfort and the pain and the grief of the circumstances that we're in. And this one, for people who were deeply affected by this, it was shocking. I mean, it was a horrible, devastating thing. For something that awful to be visible on social media, I mean, almost instantaneously, moments after, to be shared, and because of the algorithms all over the place, there is nothing that, there's not going to be a statement that just makes that less shocking, right? And so I think people just have to realize there's a grittiness and a messiness to life, that there's times where we just sit together in the discomfort and in the pain, And it's something that over time God helps us with, and he teaches us through the course of what it means to follow Jesus to be able to deal with and navigate these types of situations.
I think too, the answer really is the same for every tragic situation. When people come, and you guys both mentioned it, when people come to church and they're looking for answers in tragic moments and in moments of grief, whether that be personal or national or whatever it is, the answer is the same. We go to connect with the Spirit. We seek Jesus because he has ultimate victory over death. You know what I mean? And that those aren't simple answers,
Right.
but it's the solid answer no matter what we're facing. This one happens just to be something that happened in front of a lot of people and was tragic for our nation because it is an act of violence, and it's a terrible thing, and it should be mourned that our society stems to violence to handle its problems, and so that should be something that we mourn, and yet the answer still is the same. We look to Jesus to handle our grief. We look to Jesus in the Spirit to handle the pain that we're experiencing. We go in prayer and we seek God, hoping that He can not be not the silver bullet like you're saying, but that He can bring peace and bring comfort to us. I think some of I think I don't want to read into what people really want, wanted from a response, but because I don't want to assume people's motives or whatever, but I think there can be a tendency to try to throw to one identify because he was a Christian, because that should be an important thing to us as a church, because he's one of us, for lack of better terms. So how do we handle? How should we think about that part of it? You know what I mean? Should we acknowledge every tragic thing that happens to a Christian person? Was his primary thing? Was it his Christian faith? And like, how do we think about that? And should it be addressed?
I don't want to touch those questions. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I'll explain with the joke I was trying to make there. You said, was that even his primary thing? And I was like, oh man, that's a tough question. We'll come back to that in a second. Here's what's tough.
And if you don't want to answer, you don't.
No, I absolutely do. This is what the podcast is about. I'm not afraid to answer these questions. I think this is the tension though that people have is. This is what I was alluding to in my first answer. I think people can get so caught up in their worldview that they make the assumption everyone has this or should have this same worldview. They have to recognize that in any church, but especially in a church of our size, there are going to be so many diverse opinions about just about every single topic that we need to be smart in how to handle that. Now, I want to be clear. I am not afraid to address any topic in any way that's biblical. And I think I've shown that. I think I have that credibility with our church. I have addressed every major issue. We've talked about abortion. We've talked about sexuality. We've talked about transgender. We've talked about politics. I mean, we talk about very complex and major issues, but we're strategic about it. So this past week would be an example where I think people wanted us to take a posture. And I think as much as one group probably wanted us to grieve and to acknowledge, maybe even do some type of acknowledgement of him, I think another group probably wanted us to condemn the violence, to condemn the other side, the enemy. There's a lot of language online that's the evil. And we all are in agreement. Murder is evil. What was done to him was evil. We're not softening that in anyone that would promote that. That is evil. It's the definition of evil. But at the same time, when we come as a church, we're trying to pastor a very diverse group, all of them getting them to take steps toward Jesus. Every single week, we have people that come to our church that someone has been praying for potentially years, have invited them, and they have to have that assurance that what's going to happen on Sunday is going to be God-honoring and to remove the unnecessary distractions. And so for me, that's why every week being committed, we're going to lift Jesus up. We're going to focus on him. I can never go wrong with that. There are naturally offensive things about the gospel. It is offensive. They killed Jesus because of his message. And so there are always going to be offensive things. We're not trying to strip the gospel away from that. But there are other things that I just find unnecessary that are going to distract from the ultimate purpose of lifting Jesus high. And so if we take like a topic and if I get up on Sunday and I start speaking about it, people need to understand in the crowd, there's probably going to be, if I'm just playing the odds, a majority are going to be okay with it because they probably like his version of both politics and then Christianity. But there's going to be a percentage that possibly doesn't. That's possibly hurt by him or offended by him because of the stances he takes, because he is very conservative. And so I don't want to mix politics on a Sunday when I can lift Jesus up because it's his place, it's his church, and he's the hope. And so if I literally have had people say some version of this, that I need Jesus plus something. And I'm going, no, you don't. You need Jesus. So this past Sunday, we didn't need Jesus plus something. We needed Jesus. We needed his comfort, his word, his truth. And so when we look at it and you ask the question about even with Charlie, he was a Christian, but I think his platform was more so politics. More of his videos that I've seen, and if I'm wrong, people can correct me on this, that was his main purpose of going to college campuses was to talk politics.
Right.
He was a Christian, did not hide his Christianity, did not ever lie about it. He was very firm, outspoken about it, which I celebrate. I'm very happy about. But his main mission was political, it seemed like. And so there is a tension that naturally comes with that. And so, again, people like it, some people don't. So anyway, all that said is those are very real tensions that we have to consider in our minds. But if God would have said, speak about it, I would have. I'm not afraid to do it. I really am not. It's not. And truthfully, I don't have to defend myself. But if someone's like, oh, you're afraid, I would say, honestly, I hope people hear this as I say it. I actually have more caution knowing that if I didn't say something, I'd probably get backlash. The fear would be to not talk about it, not to talk about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I was fairly confident if I got up and just talked about it, I probably would have got a lot of positive, honestly.
Sure.
But my heart was, I just want to honor Jesus, and this is the ministry he's entrusted me to lead. And Sunday I was up teaching, and if one of you guys was up, we would have had a conversation, and you would have got up and preached Jesus.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think one of the things you touched on, like there is a complexity to this for a lot of people, because I do think there are some people that saw Charlie Kirk primarily as a Christian, right? In the sense of a champion of Christianity, a champion of Christian values. I would 100% agree with you. I think everything you said is exactly accurate from what I know. Obviously outspoken Christian. I would argue from even what he has said about himself, a lot of his political convictions and his conservative positions would have stemmed from his Christian faith.
For sure.
But at the same time, his entire organization, Turning Point, some of that stuff, essentially is to have conversations, particularly around politics, policy, with those who are at colleges and universities around the country. And so I think we do have to be careful in how we think about this, because I do think a lot of the backlash, if you want to call it that, or maybe the questioning or curiosity or disappointment, was framed around the idea that Charlie Kirk was a martyr for the faith, right? This is kind of the language that I've seen being used on social media. Not that everybody is using that language, but I think there is some sense in which even for Christians who really loved him and followed him, they felt that, right? They felt that in their emotions. And I think we do have to be very, very careful, because according to what we understand of what a martyr is, right? A martyr is somebody who legitimately dies for their faith. In other words, like their life is taken from them because of their devotion to Jesus. I don't think that's actually what happened. Now, that doesn't lessen the evil behind the act in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't make it any less tragic. But again, I do think it's important in the context of talking about this and why some people thought it should have been addressed in the church, because the reality was it was certain positions that Charlie held that ultimately led to this young man taking his life, specific things that he viewed as, hateful rhetoric, that type of conversation that led him to make that decision. And so I do think it's important that we make those distinctions. While I 100% agree, he seemed very sincere, outspoken about his Christian faith, very much so undergirded his political positions, most of them, I can say. But at the same time, it's a different kind of scenario, not something that was simply, this was a man who was, killed because he professed faith in Jesus. And I do think it's important to be intellectually honest about those types of situations. Again, doesn't make the act any less evil, doesn't make it any less tragic, and it might not make it any less painful for people who felt that emotional connection to him. But we also simultaneously have to be intellectually honest about really what was going on in this particular scenario.
Yeah, and I think to speak to that, I think it's because if we're not, then what it seems like as Christians is we are simply connecting ourselves to both his message about Christ and his politics. And we're saying that these two we're in 100% agreement on, and these two are equal, and these are the same value, and this is what we're speaking to. And we have to be careful about that because there are a lot of things that he said are conservative, and I would say the vast majority of Christians probably hold to some version of it. But if you go to an extreme on those things, there are a lot of people that were hurt by that, and they were confused by it and confused by his positions. And a lot of the stuff, from what my own research was that people are offended is oftentimes taken out of context. But it's still, when you're mixing politics, that's the challenge that you have is when you're mixing politics with the gospel, that it does get murky. And so for us as Christians, and even for us specifically as a church, we're not taking a stance on his politics. We're saying, for us, we're taking a stance on Jesus. And that's why I have pushed back on people who want to mix politics and Christianity, is I go, guys, we have the best message possible and the best hope for America in Jesus alone.
Yes.
Now, that I do believe impacts your politics.
100%.
But when you mix the two together, it's hard to differentiate. And oftentimes, that's what brings confusion and damage to people.
Yes.
And so that's why it is important to say, okay, let's use clear language on this. This is what we believe. This is what we're celebrating. This is what we're teaching, while not compromising at all and condemning the evil that was inflicted, because that is evil.
I think that's the stem of my question, because and why I wanted to talk about it is because we oftentimes do conflate the two, and we've done so in the past, and that's created a lot of damage in the church and in the culture. And so how do we as Christians live in a way that we can recognize it for what it is, like you guys are saying, but then also keep those things in separate spheres? And that's even hard to say. You're right, it's murky. It's not as we're going to need to keep politics here and Jesus here. But we need to recognize what's what. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think honestly part of this is like what you acknowledge. It's this idea that there were Christians that would have aligned with Charlie Kirk on their specific beliefs about the core tenets of the Christian faith that simultaneously disagreed on some of his policies, right? And I think that there's a whole group of Christians out there that have a complete disbelief that can be true. Like there's this idea that like if you're a Christian, then you wholeheartedly would have agreed with everything Charlie Kirk believed about his certain political convictions. And that's where I think that's again where we have to open up to this reality to say, okay, this is why we're not directly addressing this, because it can be a stumbling block. It can be a barrier specifically to Jesus, because if we make the two the same thing, if we make, okay, Charlie Kirk had a specific Christian faith and then he had all of these political beliefs, and if we equate those, well, you now essentially segregate an entire group of people who are devoted to Jesus, but may be on different places of the spectrum of political positions, but you've now essentially ostracized them because they don't hold to specific political positions, because you're equating those things with Christianity. So I do think we have to be very careful about that. And this goes back to a lot of conversations that we've had, right?
This is not the first time we've talked about this.
We've talked about politics. And again, this is where we really do have to be charitable. And I think this is a greater part of the problem as a whole. I mean, this is why ultimately I think this happened, is this idea that we really have this inability, large in part in our culture, to actually have open conversation. The idea of being able to agree to disagree, to still love each other while holding different positions. And I think both sides do it. I think you have conservative Christians who are looking at people who would claim to be Christians and yet hold maybe more liberal viewpoints, to say, well, you can't be a Christian, right? You can't be a Christian and be liberal. You can't be a Christian and be Democrat. And then you'll have people on the other side who claim to be Christians and say, well, those right-wing or conservative Christians are hate-filled and they use hate speech and hate rhetoric. And so we do this same thing. The language that we use is incredibly important. Like, as Christians, we need to be careful that we're not making these types of statements about people who claim to have faith in Jesus. And even about, I would say, people who made in the image of God. It goes back to this idea that we are now seeing people as enemies, right? This idea of they're enemies to be defeated, enemies to be conquered, to be vanquished, to get rid of, because they're the problem. They're causing this problem in our country. And if we could just eliminate them and get them out of the way. And again, not saying that most people have this idea of physical violence, But that's the type of rhetoric that we use when talking about each other. And I think in its fullest expression, this is the type of thing that happens because of it.
Right.
That political violence happens because of this. And if there should be any place in our culture where we should be setting the example to be able to love each other and despite our disagreements, it should be the church. And so I think we're the first that should have to look in the mirror and say, how are we talking about these things? How are we talking about other people who believe things differently?
Yeah, I would agree. I think we even have to be careful with how we're framing the people who are on the other side of the aisle. And what I mean by that is I think sometimes we're too quick to use terms like evil and enemy. So even you were using those language, I'm not reprimanding you. You're using them, what I'm saying as an example is we're saying the other side, because you view this topic differently than me, therefore you're my enemy and you're evil. And then we'll even say, well, okay, the scripture does talk about how I treat my enemy, how I treat evil. And I'm going, well, slow down first of all, though, because you're putting... And I want to be clear, there are some behaviors that the Bible clearly calls evil. So we call that evil.
Sure.
I'm okay with that. But when someone has a different view, does not automatically make them evil. And that's the problem is we have got to the place on both sides of the aisle, obviously, that if someone has a different perspective, they're evil and the enemy. So you have a man willing to take someone's life because they thought Charlie was both evil and his enemy. And then everyone's response is, this guy is evil and enemy. So obviously this guy doing the evil gave justification, but just because people believe differently, we have to take a step back with a much more humble heart to say, okay, what is it that they're passionate about? If you think that their only motivating force in their life is to be evil, that's intellectually lazy to me. We have to pause and go, okay, what is it that they're passionate about? Because people will take someone's argument and frame it in the worst possible light so that they can disqualify them.
Exactly.
And I think that's unchristlike. You see Christ never compromise. Like I love his interaction when he has dinner with the tax collectors, and all the religious leaders are watching this and they're just dumbfounded by it. And their response is, I thought he was religious. How can he eat with them? Jesus' response is hysterical. He goes, it's the sick who need a doctor. So like you think about it, he's saying, yes, I know that they need God, right? They need to be saved. He doesn't say they're fine. It's not that big of a deal. But at the same moment, he's relationally investing in them and loving them and not thinking about them as they're evil, they're my enemy. He's saying, yes, they need Jesus, right? They need me, but I'm also going to be in relationship to them. I don't think you can love anyone like Jesus loves them if you view them as evil and your enemy. Like you view them in such extreme that you're like, they're the person I have to extinguish, I have to attack, I have to take out. And that's the language and the rhetoric that we're hearing on both sides. And so that's a part of it. You asked the question, how can we have these opinions and these views? I think we have to take a step back and go, what's my greatest calling? My greatest calling is not to win politically. My greatest calling is to take Jesus into the world. When I understand that, then I view people differently. I view their opinions differently, their behaviors differently, and I have a different strategic response to them. When I'm viewing people as, or my greatest calling as both Jesus and politics, it's the politics that distorts it. And so like I'm seeing people, religious leaders and people online and on social media saying stuff that they're mixing politics with the faith. And it's like bumming me out because I'm going, guys, strip politics away. The world doesn't need Jesus plus a political party. The world needs Jesus. Once they have Jesus, you're going to actually see more unity and life change. I've never seen someone switch to a political party and then earn their way to heaven, right? I've seen people switch to Jesus, and I've seen it change everything in their life, even their political persuasion, because now their values have changed. But when we mix the two, I think we create an unnecessary barrier, and that's why, like we're saying, like we have to be careful about what we group together and what we celebrate.
So how do we exist in this dialogue? Like we're talking about these things where we need to exist in a space where we stop viewing someone who we disagree with as evil. How do we exist in that dialogue? How do we have conversations? How do we love like Jesus loved and yet still hold to the positions that we do?
Yeah, you got to model it. You got to model love. You have to be the initiator of it. I think Christians get in their echo chambers and they get all the people that agree with them, and they create this culture that way, and because they're viewing everyone as the enemy, the stuff that they post is basically saying to the world, I'm not really open to dialogue. I'm not open to discussion. I'm not safe to have a different opinion than me.
Yeah.
I mean, even people who mean well. And they would say, if you were to talk to them, they would say, our greatest calling is to put out evil. And I would go, I agree. I just don't think it's done that way.
Right.
I think it's done, you put out evil through love.
Yeah.
And you model Jesus. And I'm not promoting compromise. But I think we have to create an environment where it's safe to communicate with us. And so like this is what's hard. When it took place, his assassination, all three of us were out of town together. But we were out of town, and I just knew, I was like, this is going to stir up my fear. I'll say it that way. My fear was this is going to stir up some of the ugliest rhetoric from Christians. That was my fear, because I knew there was genuine pain. And I want everyone to hear my heart. I was so brokenhearted for the people who were suffering loss. I mean, obviously for his family.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, all the people who knew him and loved him, that were influenced by him, people that loved his political content. I was like, this is devastating.
Yeah.
This was it rocks people's foundation. I felt it. I felt the weight of it. I mean, I was in my hotel room, and I was just sitting there, and my wife was like, you okay? And I was like, this is just heavy.
Yeah,
and I was
it
feeling
was.
it. I sat there, and I had my phone, and I was like, what can I speak into the world right now that's not going to encourage more anger, more violence? What can I put out there that can just help people process this, to maybe have a different perspective? And so I posted with that mindset of like, can we take this down and trust in Jesus? You know, like, let's go that direction. Here's my hope. My hope is that Christians saw it and were encouraged, challenged, led by it, because I'm a pastor, I have an influence. But I was even hoping that non-Christians, people who lean liberal, would see it and go, hey, in the future, if I need to have a discussion, Matt's safe. That they can look at that, so that if I run into him in public, I'm not embarrassed to run into him. Right? I didn't unfriend a single person, and I had as many nasty things on mine from both sides. Right? I saw the people who posted stuff that disgusted me.
Yeah.
I saw the people who, some version of blaming him for his own death, and like, I'm like, I gotta be honest. I put in my post like, don't unfriend people. I gotta be honest. I wanted to. Right? I mean, like, you look at it, and I thought, you know what? There's a greater good, though.
Yeah.
And the greater good is maybe someday I can create an environment that says, I'm safe to come talk to you.
Yep.
I'm safe if you want to talk politically. I'm safe if you want to talk about religion, about God. And I don't think anyone would get this twisted, but I am conservative in my politics. I'm very conservative in my politics. But with that, I can also hear the other side and talk about it. So I don't know. I feel like I got maybe more passionate about that, but it's just, that's my heart toward it.
No, and I was just going to say, I think in both of the extreme responses, what we lose in that is the humanity in it.
Yes.
And I think you said it well. Like, we lose the fact that this Charlie was the image of God. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so a man in God's likeness got murdered. You know what I mean? And so he was dehumanized.
Yep.
And so we proliferate that. We add to that when we get nasty and we get violent, and we don't handle it in a way that elevates the dignity that God affords to us. And so I think if we're going to, and I don't know that we can view somebody as evil and hold to the rhetoric that falls on a lot of times in these, and view them as human. And I think what Jesus does is he comes back and he elevates the humanness, not just of those we agree with, but of those we disagree with.
Yeah. No, you hit it spot on, because that was the word that has literally been on my mind the last 10 minutes is to dehumanize.
Yeah.
Because what happens is when you dehumanize the other side of the political aisle, someone that disagrees with you, someone that believes differently than you, when you dehumanize them, you let yourself off the hook of having to treat them like an image bearer of God. And this should never happen for Christians. We are the ones that are called to set the example to the world. We shouldn't be shocked when people of the world do this.
Right.
And that is the important distinction, that as Christians, we need to be so careful. Like, I was even thinking of Jesus's words on the Sermon on the Mount. It's so interesting that he talks about murder, and then he talks about it in the context of hate and insulting your brother. What was Jesus talking about there? He's saying that's the starting line And that's the finish line of what happens. When you start with contempt for another person, when you insult them, when you dehumanize them, when you have hate in your heart, the fullest expression of that is what? It's murder. It's you take their life. Why? Because their life has no value to you. You stop seeing them as an image bearer of God. They no longer have any worth or value. And so when we do that with people, when we speak about that or speak about people like that, regardless of how much we might disagree with their political positions or their viewpoint on any topic, when we talk about people like that, what we're trying to do is let ourselves off the hook so that we don't have to treat them with dignity and respect and kindness with the heart of Christ. And so I was even thinking, over the last week or so, going to Romans 12. We talk about Romans 12 a lot, and I always encourage people to read Romans 12. There's just so many good parts there that Paul talks about, this Christian life that we're called to live and this posture that we're called to have. But I always just go back to this idea of don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Like when you succumb to evil, when you succumb to hatred, when you succumb to violence, and you allow that to shift your perspective of other people and change your response, you have been overcome by evil. Because the lie of the enemy is thinking, well, if I now treat this person as the enemy, it's the crusader mindset, right? I'm going to destroy this person in the name of Christ for the kingdom of God. But no, actually what's happening is you're being deceived and you're being overcome by evil rather than overcoming evil with good, which is the way of Jesus, right? The way of Jesus is to give up his own life, to become the servant, to become the sacrifice in the face of those who hated him, to pray on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. To think about the profound reality of that the people who were nailing Jesus to a cross, the people who whipped him, the people who spit on him, Jesus was praying for their forgiveness because of their ignorance, should sober us up immensely when we think about the way that we treat other people and talk about other people.
Yeah. I'm going to pause for humor. Okay, so what you just said, though, I saw this funny video, but honestly, it proves this point. It was the video was showing Michael and Gabriel, the angels in heaven, while Jesus was getting crucified, and they're up there and they're swinging their swords, they think they're about to come down and destroy the earth. And then he goes, his voice, forgive them for they know not what they do. And then both angels go, oh, good grief. They're so disappointed because but it's it really is that militant mindset of we're about to repay evil for evil, right? Yeah. We're about to destroy. And then Jesus speaks something so shockingly different that you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and that's what I was actually going to pose to both of you. And I mean this genuinely. I'm not trying to be snarky, but when Scripture says repay evil with good, will you do me a favor and define good? Because I think that's where people get misconceptions is they go, here's what's good. Good is basically destroying the evil. That's the good. But it's I think it's different than that of what he's actually saying. So when you guys read that, how do you process that?
I think of wanting good for someone that I might not like or that I might disagree with. If I can't bring myself to a place where I desire them to flourish, for them to find life, for them to be redeemed to God, if it's somebody who's even standing outside of the faith, if I can't bring myself to that place, I know I've got heart work to do because I know Jesus gave his life for the potential for that person to be redeemed. And so good is for me, I want them to have a good life. I want them to first and foremost to know the Lord and to experience the forgiveness and the freedom from their evil. I had this professor that wrote a book who really dealt into kind of some of these lines here, but the name of his book was Freedom for the Oppressor, or something along those lines. But essentially, it spoke into this idea of what we don't realize is the people who commit evil, they are just as much oppressed by evil as everyone else, and what they need is freedom from that oppression of evil on their lives. And yes, they are participating and enacting, and the things they're doing are wicked and gross and evil, but at the same time, Christ gave his life for the hope that they would see that they're enslaved to something broken and that they can find freedom in life. And that's a potential. And I think that is Paul's testimony. The reason he says I'm the chief of sinners is because he's if you can look at my life, one who was willing to murder for my religious zealousness. So he didn't conflate politics and religion. He was religiously zealous, and he murdered in that, or at least condoned murder on that behalf. He goes, then I met the risen Christ, and he gave me grace. Me who would commit violence in the name of my God, he gave me grace and showed me the way forward. And so I think for me, good is that. Can I make space for the potential and the hope that person would find Christ and that they would find flourishing, freedom from the thing that oppresses them?
Yeah, I think that part is spot on, because that was what I thought about. I think it's such a spiritual way of viewing people that is oftentimes lost on Christians. Like Paul talks about that. I think it's in 2 Corinthians where he talks about, like the God of this world has blinded people from seeing the light of the gospel. And I just don't think we think about people that way. Like we don't think about people as being spiritual captives, like people that are blind, just like Paul literally became blind. Like there's like something deeply, symbolic going on there.
Right.
That, when he was blinded in Acts 9 on the road to Damascus, he was blinded physically, but he was seeing for the first time. But there's this thing that happens, and there's spiritual bondage. People are captives. They're captives to their hate. They're captives to their racism. They're captives to the wickedness of sin inside of us and the enemy that we know is real, spiritual powers that are real in this world. So for Paul to say there are people out there that are blinded from seeing the gospel, like it's been veiled. So doing good to them is truly wanting that person that you are so tempted to view as an enemy, wanting them to be freed, wanting them to be liberated, wanting them to see Christ and to experience his love and his mercy and his forgiveness, knowing that in that, as you were saying earlier, it's going to change everything. It's going to change the views that they hold right now that you find abhorrent and evil and wicked and vile. They need to know Jesus before that changes. And so often we're focused on behavior modification, or we want people to change their views and all this stuff. And those are symptoms of the deeper problem, right? The deeper problem is if they're cut off from Christ, if they don't know him, then our desire to pursue good for them is to realize and recognize and pray for the fact that we want them to see Christ and we want them to know Christ. And so it's not only believing that and wanting that and praying for that, but it's also living in such a way and treating those people in such a way that they're going to see Christ in us. So being able to say, like, if I'm tempted to, say something super mean and nasty, like, is that going to show Christ to them? Is that going to push them towards freedom in Christ? Is that going to show them a different way? Is that going to show them a different kingdom than the kingdom of this world? Because if it's not, then it's certainly not doing them any good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm not just saying this just to be unnecessarily controversial, but one of the fallouts from the Charlie Kirk situation was a lot of people on the other side were posting nasty things and celebrating his murder and his death. And so it became this big movement to get all of those people fired. And so now people are there's lists that are being put out of this as many people have been fired. And I just remember thinking, like, what they posted was vile. There's just no way around that, to celebrate someone's murder. I mean, it's just disgusting. I mean, anger inside of me wells up. It literally does. But also I thought, is that the way to even change their thinking on anything is to get them canceled. And that's the part of me where I go, that's what feels right in the flesh, right? Let's repay evil with evil. I mean, like, let's match the energy. Let's do that. But what if the other side was everyone's response to that person? I mean, like, everyone who saw it, if their comment was like, Jesus loves you, I forgive you, even if they said it kindly, I hope you would reconsider posting this because, God loves you. I mean, that posture versus I called your boss, I shared this, I got you fired. I mean, to me, I go, like, people go, man, they deserve it. Okay. But what has changed?
They might, but
now they're just going to be angry at you. And from their perspective, it's just another thing. And again, you can continue to do that behavior, but evil begets evil. I mean, it's just what happens. And that's why Jesus is saying there is an alternative way to do this. And it might lead to a true change in someone's life. It is the harder calling. But it is the calling of Christianity. And that's why, like, we have to be voices that constantly say, let's calm it down and let's settle and can I show you love, like you guys were saying, in a way that you can understand that goes not matching your energy, that goes against what you're doing. So that it would be shocking enough to get your attention for you to ask the question, why? Why would you love me that way? Why would you respond that way? And I think that we just don't see enough of it because we've been so conditioned to respond and then put like a sprinkle of Christianese on it and say like, well, I'm just fighting against evil. And I'm like, but you're fighting against evil with evil. You're doing the world's method, and that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, and I think that if you look at the way Paul talks about religious things, or like you said, sprinkling religious things on top of unchrist-like ways, like that is his key, like, pushback. The entirety throughout Corinthians, they're doing spiritual things without the actual heart and ways of Christ. And so, like, we have to not just be people who bear a name Christian. We have to be people who live that out in our lives. We have to be people who treat other people based on that ethic, and it's got to permeate our entire lives and our politics, the way we handle our politics as well. Because I think it is good for, like you guys both said, it's good for us to be political. We should have thoughts about what makes society flourish. But if we don't do it in the way of Christ, if we can't treat other people as human beings, and we can't, even if we disagree with them, we can't do that, then we're just sprinkling Christ on top, and that's more dangerous than anything.
I agree, because I think it distorts his message, and it paints the worst image of who he is.
Yeah.
So
one of the things I was thinking about, and I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. I want to share just briefly, one of the things that I'm thinking about. But like, what should our advice be, our wisdom be to Christians? Like, when something like this happens, give some practical like steps, because I think that's what really a lot of people need right now. It's like, what do we do? How do we respond? What should we do? What should we not do? How do we react? Is it okay to post? Should we not post? Because here's even one of my regrets. I posted about it on Facebook pretty quickly. Now, granted, it was a pretty short post, and it was actually a reshare. I basically said a few things, and it was a reshare about really the way of Jesus. But even as I'm thinking about this and have been processing this, I would say some advice that I would give to other people would be, number one, sit on it for a moment. Like, I think so often we have knee-jerk responses and actions that don't represent the heart of Christ, because it's purely out of raw emotion. And this is actually, I think, good advice in any context, whether you're married or with your kids. Like, I think a lot of times we're so quick to speak, we're so quick to react. And I would say, like, one of the things that we need to be able to do is to sit in it and to process it ourselves, and even maybe bring it to God before anything else. But I just would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that, because I do think to give people some practical insight and wisdom when horrible things like this happen that are so divisive or so shocking or so evil, I do think it stirs people's emotions in very, very deep, profound ways. And what we want to do is give Christians the best pathway forward so that we collectively can represent Christ well to a watching world that needs to see a different example.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the stuff you already said is great advice. I think giving it a pause before you post anything. Now, I want to say this, and this isn't to give me an excuse. I'm posting probably from a different perspective than a lot of people, in the sense that I'm posting from a position of leadership and influence, right. And so I'm trying to encourage the people that have entrusted leadership to me. So that's probably the only reason why I post quickly sometimes in these events. But I think for the most part, people, you need to pause. I think you should absolutely go to God first. Even just with, I think, what your heart needs, of going to God and saying, will you help? Because I would imagine a lot of people were really scared and hurting, frustrated, all of those emotions, and just saying, God, will you touch my heart right now? I mean, this is what Scripture tells us to do, to cast our cares upon Him. And His promise to us is to give us peace. And so to go to Him. The second thing I would say is, if you're going to post, I think you should think of the ramifications of your post. What's the worst that can happen with this, and what's the best that can happen? If the worst that can happen is, like, some people might not like it because I lifted Jesus up, well, that's okay. If the worst that can happen is people think I went too soft and I should have gone harder, that's okay. But if the worst that can happen is you can wound people and offend people, you can put strain in relationships, especially on the other side, I don't think it's worth it. And I think taking a pause and relaxing is key. Now, I want to be a realist. I think asking people to disconnect immediately is not realistic. And I think actually might even create some anxiety with people. So I think people they're searching on information, they're trying to figure out. And I think that's a natural part of our process. But I think I even made a post about this. I think at some point you got to turn the faucet off. That's just feeding your heart with anxiety. Because I know how I was. I mean, initially it was just like information gathering. You and I were right next to each other in a tour, and I showed you. I said, man, Charlie Kirk got shot. And we were like, oh, man. And then I think later on we both realized, I think you told me, you said, oh, he actually died. They've come out and said that. Well, for the next however long, I mean, we're just, during that gap in between him being shot and his death being pronounced, we're constantly, at least I was, refreshing my phone. I'm looking for information. Then after, and like, that's a natural process. But at one point I realized, like, this is just actually creating tension in me. I'm seeing people's posts, and it's making me angry at people. I'm frustrated by people on both sides. I'm hurt by both people on both sides. And there was just a time where I thought, you know what? I realize I'm a leader and I have to connect at times, but I have to turn this faucet off for a moment.
Sure.
And so, like, I had to turn that off, but at the same time, turning on what pours into the heart, I think peace. Things like worship music and prayer, going for walks, hanging out relationally, not watching the news. I think those things, you have to be intentional about it, because I think all of us to some degree can get a pulse on it when you can realize I'm amping up. I'm not amping down.
Right.
Yeah.
And for me personally, the most amped up version of me will not speak like Jesus, will not think like Jesus.
Right.
And I mean, like, if I post from a place of anger, I've always regretted it in my life. I've never had an angry post that I later thought, man, that was really reflected my heart or Jesus' heart. Never. And I've deleted. Have you guys had delete posts where you're like, oh, this feels great in the moment, and then later on you're like, why did I do that?
Yeah.
And delete it, so.
Yeah, I would say for me, what I'd encourage people to do is, and I'm going to step out of the social media world, because one, I don't have social media, so I'm not really kind of caught up with like the best way to do that. But I would say if you have family members or friends who do disagree and have maybe posted things that are hurtful and were not the kindest things to say in those moments and dehumanizing, I would say measure your relationship with that person. And if you have the space within that relational context to speak truth in a kind and loving way, in an encouraging way that would bring fruit from the conversation, absolutely have that conversation with them. I would encourage you to say, hey, this is kind of a hurtful thing. I don't know if you see it that way. But if it's not going to be fruitful and you know it's just going to amp it up, I would say keep your peace.
Yeah.
Because I don't know why Jesus said it this way, and I think it was Jesus, but don't cast your pearls before swine. Essentially, the idea of, if it's going to be an unfruitful conversation, you know it's going to be an unfruitful conversation. Don't waste your time on it. And essentially is, and that way you might still keep peace and keep the relationship healthy. And so I would encourage you, measure well who it is that you're called to speak truth to. Can it be a fruitful thing that you can do without being amped up, like you said? And no, like the social media post where you're blasting people, where you're dropping truth bombs, is probably not going to be the most fruitful end. So finding the ways in which that dialogue is beneficial and helpful to bring humanity, to bring Christ back to the situation.
I think one of the best things with communication, so you and I today were just talking about parenting. We had lunch together and talking about our kids and just throughout the years of how you parent and stuff like that. Well, one of the most loving things you can do as a parent is to discover how to communicate to your kids individually, knowing their personalities, knowing when is a good time, when's a bad time. And like, you can do the militant thing as a parent. We've all done it as dads, where you're like, I am in charge, you will listen to me, like, and we've done that. And sometimes that's necessary, but there's also times as parents where you look at your kid and you think, if I have this conversation right now, it's not the best version of them.
Right.
And so it's not going to be fruitful. And so in humility and grace, you give that to your kid, and then later on you have a discussion. I think the same thing. If someone comes in super hot on social media, I think that's a tell that they're probably not in a position right now. What's going on? They're angry, they're scared, they're hurt, they're frustrated. Probably not the best time to say, hey, let me give you the counterpoint to that, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, I think humility and love says, like, I'll hold off.
Yeah.
And maybe later we'll have a conversation and we can talk about it if it gets there. But love says, you know what? I don't need to address that right now.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking of that goes right along with that too, and we've talked about this before, like being the type of person that rather than making statements or casting judgment, where you actually have a level of curiosity, like relational curiosity, to where like someone says something like particularly about this that you're like, man, that felt really insensitive, about what happened. And again, your natural propensity is going to be to go to anger, to hate, to think, how could they say that? How could they think that? And again, maybe flipping that to say, yeah, maybe the time isn't that moment in a heated exchange, but at some point to say, hey, I noticed you said this. To be quite honest, I don't understand, why you think that. Would you would you care to share your thoughts on this? Would you care to share your opinions on this? Because I'm trying to understand, or maybe even like, this seems to be not from what I know of you, this doesn't seem to make sense to me. I would love to understand why you responded this way.
Why you feel that
because
way.
I don't think a lot of us, again, do that naturally. We just make up assumptions in our minds about why people say things or do things.
And it's usually negative.
Absolutely. No, we do. We fill in the gaps with negativity. And again, I think this is an area where Christians can really set the culture in our country to be the ones who are actually trying to bridge the gap and to try to have dialogue. And yes, we realize like there's a sacrifice involved in that it's really difficult. Like, it's uncomfortable to put yourself in places like that where you're asking for someone's opinion, asking for someone's thoughts. And again, it goes back to what we've talked about many times, asking so that you can actually understand and not just to argue, right? Not just to respond with your points. Now, granted, that might open up a dialogue where they're curious to hear from you. I think this is a great evangelism strategy, by the way, like hearing a person's beliefs, hearing a person's story, hearing a person's convictions, and actually pressing them with questions oftentimes disarms people and allows them then to say, well, why do you view this? Why do you believe in this? So I think even just leading the way, I would say leading with humility, leading with curiosity, to where, again, we don't naturally go to a place where we're dehumanizing someone because we're making all of these assumptions, but rather we give them a more charitable assumption, the benefit of the doubt, and actually go to them and say, hey, when you said this, honestly, it surprised me, but I really want to genuinely know where you're coming from and would love to hear your perspective on this. Most of the time, people are going to respond in a positive way when you lead with that type of humility.
And I think I agree. I think it diffuses even them.
Yeah.
I think if they had genuine intensity, when they have that type of respect, in my experience, people do dial it down.
Yep.
Because you're not coming in hot. I think if you come in hot, they're already fired up. They just go, okay, let's go.
Yeah.
Let's fight this out. And when you come in and go, man, I want to hear, I want to learn. And even if you can say things like, at any point where they make a good point, they say something you've never thought about, just to acknowledge that, to go like, oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Oh, I get what you're saying there. Okay, I understand that. Like, to me, whenever someone has talked to me that way, I mean, I've had my wife de-escalate me that way. I've had other people where they go like, oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
And you're like, what?
I don't got to argue this anymore.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're like, all right, hold on, give me a second, because I was thinking we were going to go in an
Your
argument.
defensiveness goes down, right, immediately.
Yeah, I remember, I told the story before. I remember one time, this only happened one time that I can remember. We were in the middle of the argument. My wife goes, okay, I get what you're saying, you're right. And I was like, oh. And she goes, are you okay? And I literally said to her, I'm just going to need a minute, because my adrenaline was already going, and I've never had this happen before, but it's true, though, like, we can do that through our language. I would encourage people to, like, know the form of communication that you're at your best. I think oftentimes writing lacks emotion, and so you have to be really skilled to really communicate the emotion and to lower it. And so, like, if it's talking on the phone is better, talking face to face, going to a restaurant, even setting the environment to say, hey, I'd love to take you out for coffee. I'd love to take you out to get a bite to eat so we can talk about it, where you just know, like, we're setting the tone of it. I think we just have to be really intentional. Again, why? You said this earlier. You said it's not the easier path, right? It's hard. It's difficult. And I think we have to understand we have a calling, and our calling is worth it. It's the thing I keep saying to our church. It's worth it, because to have someone saved because of the love and grace that you showed them is the greatest. I think it's the greatest use of the grace that we've received in our lives. One another quick story. So I saw this reel, and I didn't know any context for it, but it was a father at a court hearing talking to the serial killer that killed his daughter. And this guy gets up and he says, I forgive you. And so I didn't know any context. I don't know much about serial killers. And so I was flipping through Netflix a couple weeks ago, and I saw it pop up, and I was pretty sure that was a serial killer. I saw the face. And so I was like, oh, I'm curious about this story. And I clicked it, and it was just the worst. It was a good documentary in the sense that it was well done, but it was just talking about this guy, brutal. I think he found that he killed 49 women. I mean, it was just, it was awful. I mean, it was just horrible to watch. It's horrible for your soul to go through all of that. The only reason I watched it is I was fairly confident this was the same one. And sure enough, at the very end, you have the people get up that are like, may you rot in hell. Like, every bad thing that's going to happen to you, you deserve. And then this dad gets up. He just looks kind of like a good old boy. He has overalls. Like, he looks like Uncle Jesse from like Dukes of Hazzard, like that kind of look. But he just gets up and he says, I forgive you because that's what Jesus told me to do. And the serial killer starts bawling. I mean, he's crying. And I thought in that moment, like, it was sobering, where I thought, what if that is the seed that leads to this man having all of his sins forgiven? Like, what incredible calling for that guy to respond that way. Because, I mean, all of us are dads, and we're all dads to daughters.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine the rage and what you would want to do?
Yeah.
And you think, why does that make sense? It only makes sense because of the grace that was showed that father, that he knows he's going to have eternity with Jesus.
Yeah.
That type of grace is what we have to view other people through, that are on the other side of the aisle, other side of evil, other side of doing things. And one of my favorite posts that I've seen throughout this whole situation is that Charlie Kirk would want this man saved.
Yeah.
He would forgive this man if this man confessed his sins.
Yeah.
And I thought, yes,
Yeah.
that we need more of that. And I think that's genuinely true. Like, from everything I saw with him, and it's like, what a beautiful sight. If this guy gets saved, and for him and Charlie to be reunited in heaven without any animosity, it's possible. And there's other people in this that are filled with hurt and rage. And if we can show that love, it's like, that's the potential we have to draw people back to Jesus. And again, that's why we do what we do. That's why we point people to Jesus. That's why we don't take hard stances on certain things. It's not out of compromise. It's out of a deep love and hope that all can be saved by knowing Jesus.
Yeah, because
So
that sets the foundation for everything that we...
Everything.
Everything. So...
Yeah, if you're ever confused, I say this not in arrogance. If you're ever confused, give us the benefit of the doubt that it's motivated by we're pushing people toward Jesus. Literally, every conversation we have behind the scenes, it's never out of fear. It's never out of just trying to cop out and say, hey, I'm going to take the easy path. It's always about how can we push people toward Jesus in our community? How can we best leverage the influence that God has given us? How can we honor what he's called us to do? And I think, again, we saw the fruit of it last week. Having 34 people saved is a remarkable thing to celebrate. This Sunday, 40 people getting baptized.
Yep.
It's 42, I think, actually.
That's awesome.
In Lancaster.
So
I know Logan will be coming later, but super exciting.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for the conversation. Any closing thoughts or anything else that you wanted to share before we wrap up?
Thought that was a good way to end.
Yeah.
Good.